Welcome to another Unwinding with Fiber and Fabric, and welcome back to my regular viewers. Today is going to be a fabric day. I have 3 quilts to share with you. One that is a wall hanging, one that is going to be a pillow cover, and one that is a tree skirt for a Christmas tree. I was hoping to share with you some actual hand quilting, as an example, some B-roll, but sadly, I cut my finger. It is not a bad cut. It's just that the cut is right along the fingernail and under the tip of the fingernail. And for any of you that are out there doing handwork, you know that is not the place. That is not the place to get a cut, even a minor one, when you are working with fiber and fabric. So no B-roll. So I decided instead I would talk to you about some of the tools I use when I'm quilting. And the first thing I want to do, and we're just going to go ahead and dive in, before I show you any of the quilts, let me just explain for those of you that maybe are new to quilting, or maybe English isn't your first language and you want to understand the terminology that we sometimes use, or maybe you're people who are familiar with all of this but didn't know there's actually some distinction. A lot of quilters use the word quilting for the whole process, and there is nothing wrong with that. But technically, if we're going to be technical, quilting is the process of layering together, there we go, layering together the top, the batting or wadding, and the backing. Now, sometimes you will have quilting that is just a top layer and a back layer. Traditionally, in many cultures, the process of attaching these 3 layers together, or sometimes it was 2 layers, or it might be a really thick top layer and a thinner back layer. But the process of attaching these layers together is known as quilting. At least that's the English term for this process. And you will find this process throughout the world where you find fabric made into, most historically, clothing. Some of the great examples of quilting that survive, and some of the oldest examples of quilting that survive, are actually the quilted armor that was used. You have in medieval suits of armor or knights, you have a quilted, let's say, tunic that would go under chainmail to protect the body from the metal, from the metal. It also acts as a bit of an armor in itself. If you go into Japan, I believe it's Japan, or maybe it's China, or maybe it's both. But if you go into, in essence, Asia, you will find evidence of quilted armor. You'll have to look that up because I know there's some different treatments. But in short, you have layers of fabric, layers of fiber, quilted together with running stitches that form this dense, what we would say, this dense quilt-like structure that makes up the clothing. And it is actually quite a deterrent. I think something like Mythbusters a number of years ago may have done a little, experiment to see just how much force it could take. But quilting as a technique is ancient. The making of a quilt for a bed may not be as ancient. Oftentimes you would layer blankets to get that air pockets trapped. But certainly with modern times, the comforter and the quilt dominate if you want those layers of air caught between the outside world and you when you're sleeping. And so that is where the quilt comes in. Excuse me. So terminology, quilting is the process of combining those 3 layers. A comforter, in some terminology, is those layers combined, but usually combined instead of with a running stitch and lots of stitching, it's sometimes created with wide open stitching or tufts, little ties of yarn or thread to hold the layers together. So it's puffier, so that's held together minimally, creating more volume of air sometimes. A faster project. So there's the terminology. A quilt and a comforter can be the same thing. Quilting is those running stitches. Let me show you. Let's see. Actually, so we'll start with this one. This is a piece that my son has been working on. And you can see, there we go, his stitches. He's been practicing a little bit. It's not technically what we would call a big stitch, but he's been practicing working on his hand quilting, working on the evenness of the spacing of the stitches and the size of the stitches. And you can see the 2 rows of running stitches right there. Okay, so he's been working on this. This is going to be for a pillow cover. And now that I've discussed quilting, the process of attaching these 3 layers together, let's talk about what type of patchwork, and there's the big word, what type of patchwork he's doing. So patchwork is when you take multiple patches of fabric and you attach them together to create a design layout for your quilt. In this case, he is using he's using foundation paper piecing. For those of you that have been following me for a while, you know that I have taken up doing a bunch of English paper piecing. This is foundation paper piecing, sometimes abbreviated as FPP as opposed to English paper piecing, which is EPP. I don't know when those terminologies came into being, probably a more recent addition to our vocabulary rather than an older one. But this one is based upon drawing out your lines that you're going to stitch on a foundation, a paper, or actually traditionally people would draw them out on muslin. And then they would stitch the fabric to the muslin, stitch a line, fold the fabric back over so that you don't have any raw edges. The classic foundation piecing design is, believe it or not, the crazy patch and log cabin quilts. So while we can do crazy patch and we can do log cabins without a foundation today, especially where we are cutting strips of fabric with our rotary cutters, the traditional way of getting this intricate piecing patchwork design was to draw out the design we want or to use a piece of muslin as a foundation. Because when you are using scraps, when you are using shapes like this, when you're using scraps for that, scraps are often not cut on the straight of grain, not cut even on, not cut along the warp or the weft. It's usually cut at some variation of the bias, the diagonal. And the bias, so if I'm going to use this as an example here. Actually, it might be easier if I use this because there's more. This doesn't stretch. This has a little stretch. So this is probably the warp. Yep, that's running along the warp. You got the selvage edge. And this one, actually, I've torn the edges, so I've lost my selvage. Here we go. You can see that. That has a stretch. There's a little give to that. This one, on the other hand, there's no give. And from my understanding, that warp is less likely to have any kind of give. It's pretty taut. Weft has a little bit of stretch. But if I go here on the diagonal, you can see that stretch. So when we have fabric that is cut on an angle, and even if I go slightly, you start getting until you get right on the diagonal. Fabric that is cut randomly without being true of grain can stretch, and that can distort your project. So using a foundation stabilizes it. Today, if you do machine embroidery, you know we use stabilizer all the time. If you're constructing clothing, we use interfacing all the time. Using a foundation helps stabilize all of these seams that may be on bias cut fabric. So it helps with the precision. It can also, we can trace lines onto our foundation, and we can stitch along those, creating intricate patterning. So if you're interested in what I'm talking about, curious a little bit more, look up some information on foundation paper piecing. It's a fabulous technique. My son loves it. My daughter says, okay, it makes me think backwards from what I'm used to, and so she doesn't like it. So sometimes our brains gravitate to one thing more than the other. And that was the case. So this is now quilted. My son's practicing his quilting. This is now quilted, and then we just are going to, and when we quilt it, I like to have just a plain fabric here to quilt through. This is not the back of the pillow. We'll add a back of a pillow. In this case, it won't be quilted. It will be just regular fabric. We'll add a backing to it, and then it will become a pillow. It could very well be a little wall hanging if we wanted it at this stage. You might notice all those quilting stitches, just to talk about it, all those running stitches, okay? All those running stitches in that are hiding in the orange, and yet this is a cream. We actually had them, you can see, stitch out in different colors. And that's the wonderful thing with pillows, is no one's going to see the back. And well, if they did, who cares if there's different colors on the back? So if you choose a backing on your quilt that's really intense like this, it's not going to matter what threads you use. You're not going to see a lot of your stitches. But for somebody who is learning how to do the quilting stitch, the running stitch, the tiny running stitches, or even if you're wanting to practice the big stitch, which is, I usually will use a little bit thicker thread than a standard quilting thread. If you are trying to learn how to do this, this is a fabulous size. Pillow covers are a fabulous way to practice. They're easy to hold on to. They're easy to move around with you. And you can hide the back of your stitching because you're going to make it into a pillow. It's a lovely way to practice. When I was learning how to quilt years and years and years ago, I was taught to, if I wasn't sure about my stitches, to stitch in the ditch. Stitching in the ditch is not actually the easiest place to stitch a running stitch. It is actually much easier to practice your running stitches, to practice your quilting stitches on plain cloth. Draw a design on it and stitch with plain cloth. That is a good place to practice getting even stitches, and that's what's important. You're aiming for even stitches and even coverage through it. So in this case, trying to have an even amount, and let's sew the back, a consistent level of quilting. Now, it doesn't have to be a consistent all through it. Like, we want this to have definition and this to be puffier on the quilt. You can pick and choose how dense of quilting you do, but the quilting there should be some consistency. And if you notice, he's trying to keep about that space, and there's a little bit closer space, trying to have all of the area that needs to be tacked down. This batting, this wadding, really does best if it is quilted having the bigger area is no bigger than like 3 inches, okay? Which is, I guess, like 70 millimeters, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. So if you look here, his wide open spaces aren't any bigger than that. Don't mind the border, because some of that's actually going to be cut away when we do the pillow. But this area is the largest he wanted to have open and puffy. He wanted to keep everything else just a little bit more stitched. So those are some of the things that you can think about. There's the running stitch, and the foundation paper piecing. Now, for those of you who've been following me, you know, oh, sorry, I have something on my lip here. My cat had just come over outside of the camera. My cat had just come over and run under my legs. And I think he might have puffed up some hair because my face now feels just a little itchy. But for those of you that have been following, you know, I took up English paper piecing a year ago. Now, English paper piecing is an interesting thing because English paper piecing and template piecing, using templates to cut out your shapes, they're pretty much, they use the same pattern, and while the construction is different, there's a lot of similarities between template sewing or cutting out all your pieces with templates and then sewing in the 1/4 inch seam allowance and English paper piecing. The main difference, using the exact same template shape, with English paper piecing, I have a piece. With English paper piecing, you're cutting out ahead of time a bunch of paper, in this case cardstock, a bunch of paper templates that you then glue your seam allowance around so that you can hold two pieces together. And I do not think that is going to show up. Let me try to get in there close. You might be able to see the whip stitches that I'm using to sew that edge together. Let's see. There we go. Maybe the orange side. Yes, you can see the little whip stitches. Whip stitches being over from one side to the front and over. So I'm putting stitches over that, as opposed to a running stitch. Now, if I had cut all of these out without the intent to glue them together, making sure I'm getting an exact 1/4 inch seam allowance, that is not an exact 1/4 inch. See, the wonderful thing with English paper piecing is that you just have to have the piece kind of fussy cutted larger than your papers, and then you glue them or baste them down, and then eventually you peel. I've used the gluing method. You come in, and you pull out the paper. I can pull out the centers because once all the edges of your piece are sewn, you can take out the papers, or you can leave them in and take them all out at the end. But I'm tending to take these out so we can reuse these because this is for a king size quilt that we're working on. Oh, so yes, there's a lot of this that is going on. So English paper piecing, there is the template. Now, with template piecing, we'd have a template like this, but we would make sure to cut the fabric out with precise 1/4 inch seam allowances so that and we may even mark or draw on the fabric that exact shape and have those stitching lines. Because what we're going to do is set that up against, let me get another, I have another one here. Pretending this is my fabric, we're going to set that right up against another piece, because yes, I don't have any little fabrics. And we're going to do a modified running stitch to sew that seam together. Now, some people I know are just doing a running stitch, but it is better to do either a back stitch or a modified running stitch. And when I say modified running stitch, it means after you take a few stitches, you're going to go back on yourself one stitch. And that's going to it's going to basically form a little, not a knot, but a little anchor. So when you're sewing your little template pieces together by hand, as opposed to your sewing machine, and most of us do template piecing these days with our sewing machine. And we would just cut out our pieces, and then we'd go over to our sewing machine and we'd sew from edge to edge, not with hexagons. There's a tricks to that if you're doing it on there. If you're wanting to do your hexagons on the sewing machine, my recommendation is to look up some of the tips and tricks. One of the things that you want to do is mark where the 1/4 inch is on and stop and start at the quarter inch down. Look up some videos if that's really what you want to do. But let's say it was just a big square. You would stitch along with your sewing machine, 1/4 inch in, and keep on going. And you can do the assembly line just on your sewing machine, one little patch setup as you go. That's what a lot of people do. That's what I've done on this tree skirt that I'm doing. But when you're wanting to sew templates together by hand, you're going to use either what's called a back stitch, or you need to have a modified running stitch, because you need to have that seam secure. When we are doing English paper piecing, that seam that I showed you, here, let me get one that I still have the paper in. That seam that I'm doing is one of the most secure seams, because look at all those tiny little stitches. And so that, and I can't see them on the front, but that is a lot of little stitches holding that fabric together, and that's very durable. A running stitch alone for piecing the patches together isn't going to be as durable as you need it for use. So by taking small stitches and every so often taking a back stitch, you'll increase the strength and durability of it. Because a running stitch, the only difference between a running stitch and a gathering stitch is usually the length of the stitch. And a gathering stitch is what we run through with a running stitch, having big open spaces so that we can gather up the fabric. And that can happen even when we're going through a quilt and even when we are sewing seams. So my tip on that. I'm looking at the time and I'm thinking we may actually end up going a little bit over, because I still have a little bit longer than I expected. This won't be as short because I still have a couple things to share with you. The first of which is, and I'll just show it here and then I'll show a big picture out. I have finally finished my English paper piecing winter with my winter evergreen and stars wall hanging. This one's a big long one. I'll have to put it up on the wall and take a picture and share. But the reason I wanted to certainly show this now is because in talking about English paper piecing versus foundation paper piecing, you see that my English paper piecing is much more still the grid type patchwork, whereas my foundation paper piecing is lots of little shards. But I finished this one. I am working on a pattern. Sorry, I have something on my lip. Okay, I am working on the pattern and I am going to upload it and put it on my, I'm going to put it on my blog. I'm going to put it on my blog closer to Christmas, closer to winter. Okay, so I will show this again. I will show this again in a few weeks. But what I wanted to share with you today with it is, one, I finished it. And two, this is, while it is English paper piecing, and English paper piecing can be hexagons, or it can be, sorry, I'm waving. I have somebody at the door and they're going to come around the other way. So excuse me. No, I'm sidetracked. I'm so sorry. Okay. English paper piecing can be lots of little hexagons and diamonds and shapes. It can also be squares, half square triangles, standard template piece patchwork. I wanted to share this with you because this is a fabulous example of something that can be done English paper piecing, or could be done traditional, what we now say modern patchwork, with the sewing machines, the rotary cutters, etc. And I chose to do English paper piecing and sew all of this by hand. I find that doing English paper piecing is a wonderful way to have precision, to have all these little pieces, to deal with different shapes. And I can do it from the comfort of my comfy chair rather than sitting at the sewing machine. So I'm really enjoying doing my intricate patchwork English paper piecing. Template piecing, or what we now do where we are stringing together, rotary cutting and stringing together at the sewing machine, piece after piece, that way. When we rotary cut, we can sometimes lose a little bit of the precision. Now, we can work really hard, like I have done with my latest project. We can work really hard. We can cut as accurately as possible. We can make sure all of our points match up, and people do. And we can do small pieces, we can do large pieces. But for me, I think I like the English paper piecing a little bit more than sitting at the sewing machine. But this took me quite some time to actually put together. This one took me a couple sessions at the sewing machine. And so this is a tree skirt. What I do with my tree skirts, I will quilt everything, and then I'll leave one side open. So I'll actually show you that. That's where I'm actually starting my quilting. So you will see here, you can actually see the batting. I haven't sewn that seam. Sometimes I've sewn the seam and then I'll just cut it away, but I'm going to cut open to the center and remove a little bit of the center, and then put binding around it so that this can slide onto the tree, around the tree, wrap around the tree easily. That's the trick I do. So it will be a quilt, but it'll be a quilt with a slash up it. And I'm making this one for my daughter. It is a block that when I get this finished, closer to probably, I need to have it actually finished by the, I need to have it finished by Halloween, basically, because I'm taking it up to my daughter, taking a trip up to see my daughter the beginning of November, and I need to have it finished. So I will share the block that I have made with you. So I'm not going to share the whole quilt because I would have to really work on explaining how I do these corner pieces. But I have created a block that you can see between this white and the end. I've created a block that I really enjoy, that I want to share with you all, because it is a fabulous way of using different sizes and shapes of, or different sizes of rectangles and squares to create a lovely look. And it is direct. I've worked hard to have mine directional so that all of my, let's see. So these guys are all facing out. You can see the little critters on the tree skirt. So that's what I've been working on with what we now, I would say, let's call it modern piecing, where we're using a rotary cutter, cutting out, not using a template, not sitting down and tracing out or cutting out all the individual pieces using templates. And there are plastic templates you can get that you can use with a rotary cutter to make it a lot faster. But templates versus rotary cutter instructions in which we cut. I think, that's what strip piecing is, what I think sometimes you'll hear people say. You're cutting lots of strips of fabric, and then you're cutting those strips of fabric down into the pieces that they need to be, and then you're sewing them back up in rows to create a grid. You can really see, in this case, the grid that I'm talking about, because you have a long seam that's going down here. You have a long seam, well, until you get here. And that's the thing. When doing English paper piecing or template piecing, you may not have seams that run all the way down the grid, but it is still a grid. We've just done some modifications. We haven't cut a seam there. When I was making this piece here, this triangle with two little wings on it, that piece is commonly known as a part of the flying geese pattern, a goose, a flying goose, a goose there. So that is a flying geese block. And when I was first making them, years and years ago, the easy way to do it is to actually have a seam there. So you're doing all these little half square triangles out there, kind of half square triangles. Let me bring that in. This is what we call, that one right there, the dark and the light, a half square triangle. And so you take, and so two half square triangles together, and there you have it. You actually have that same goose shape, the triangle, the bigger triangle forming the flying geese shape. And when I was doing this years ago, that's how I did my first flying geese quilt, is I took half square triangles and I sewed them together. A lot more points that have to match. I much prefer doing it now, and there's a lot of, this way now, and there's a lot of lovely tips and tricks and rulers that people do that that make it easier to construct the goose. But when I said about grid, you'll notice here the grid lines come down here. I have a big seam here and I have a big seam here, but here in the center there is actually a seam going here creating the grid. So the grid pattern. I'm being distracted. I'm all over the place. You can definitely see my grid sewing here. You can see these four squares make the same size as this. This is half of that type of size. So trying to hold my quilt up. So you have, this is the same width as these two, so 2 inches. There we go. And then I have the little 4 square block, and then I have a big solid block. Fabulous way to use your fun prints in this block. And so as I said, I will share that block. Actually, you know what? I've changed my mind. I'm going to share this block today. I will share the pattern for the winter quilt closer to Christmas. But I'm going to go ahead and upload today this block that I have designed, instructions just for that block. I'm going to share that with you. So if you want to play around with a little patchwork, I'll give you a block that's different. It's different from, I don't believe it's one that anybody else has made. It's probably very similar to others that other people have made. That's the wonderful thing about patchwork, is that it is very reusable. We don't really have a cornerstone. We don't have an ownership of simple layouts, because anybody else could come up with the same layout. But I found this to be a very fun block. I will tell you, it is not a square block unless you put this white piece on top. It is a rectangular block. And I like occasionally having a rectangle rather than a square to work with. There's times when it's really useful. So I've gotten completely all befuddled. But I did want to share with you one more thing. I talked about some of the things that, I've talked about a lot of the stitching that I do, the running stitch, and just grab my sewing box and bring it over here. The running stitch and the whip stitch that I use, and the modified running stitch or back stitch. So to recap, I quilt with a running stitch. I piece my patches together either on the sewing machine or with a whip stitch for the English paper piecing. Or if I were hand sewing with templates, I would use a modified running stitch or a back stitch. And I will have been putting all these words up here so you can see them. You can look them up. There's wonderful quilting organizations, pattern companies, fabric companies that they'll have lots of these type of tips and tricks. If you look from really good magazines out there that will give you, show you basic information. Okay, but what I want to share with you is a couple of the things that I use. One, a lot of times I just do, when I'm hand quilting, I do lap quilting. I quilt sitting in my lap, not at a frame. You can get quilting frames. You can get standing quilting frames. You can get portable handheld quilting frames. A frame can help with a lot of the precision. If you're doing lots of little tiny stitches, it can help densely quilt an area. It is, my son has found the same thing I did. When you're doing something in your lap and it doesn't, and you're not going to densely quilt it, just doing it without a frame and holding the fabric can work. Just be careful not to pull too tightly on those running stitches because, as I said, they gather your fabric. So the other thing I wanted to share is thimbles. There are two types of thimbles that I use. One, and I can actually, this is the problem. So this is my thimble that I actually use on my thumb because I'll push the needle up when I'm hand quilting. I'll push the needle up with my thumb or press it in with my finger. But here's the thing. I have to use my thumb thimble for my finger with the Band-Aid on it right now. But I always keep two on hand. One for my, set that one down. One for my thumb and one for my index finger when I'm doing the running stitch, the quilting stitch. Okay, because I have learned how to quilt pretty much in every direction except for maybe backwards. And I can in a pinch if I have to do that, but I'll quilt down, I can quilt up, and I can quilt from right to left. Those are the directions, and this may be reversed for you. If it is, I'm apologizing, but I can quilt up and down with my thumb or my index finger. I can quilt right to left. For me, quilting left to right is only for really bizarre situations, which I try to avoid. If you're left-handed, of course, it's going to be opposite. You'll probably quilt left to right. Definitely from top to bottom. Okay, that is easy for a lot of people to do. Going from bottom up, that is a little bit more practice. If you practice, you'll get the skill to be able to do that. And if you're a little more ambidextrous, you might be able to do all four directions. So these are my quilting thimbles. Now, I show those to you. I also can quilt with this one. I have moved to using these open ones because then it doesn't put as much pressure on my fingernails. And I actually reshaped this fingernail quite a bit years ago when I was quilting with it. But these closed ones, there's also leather thimbles, which my son is using, and I forgot to bring one over here. But he uses a leather one because his thumb, the shape of his thumb, is too big even for one of these that open up. Now, these open up in the back and can be resized, but if you notice, there's a little tape on it. I've put a little tape around it because the metal of it can cut into my finger just a little bit, press in, and I don't like it. So you can put a little tape, a little moleskin, something that's nice. This is a cloth tape, much like the Band-Aid that I have on my finger, and it makes it so that those edges don't cut into my finger at all. For the longest time, though, I actually quilted with this type of bobbin, and thimble. And let me just show you. So, nope, that one's too tight. I'm trying to see if I have one that is big enough here that I can put over my bag. Ah, there we go. All right. So, when I am doing EPP, or when I was using this type of thimble for my quilting, I keep multiple sizes on hand because if I am quilting, I will quilt with either this, I will quilt with this finger, my index finger. If I'm doing EPP, I will quilt with this finger, or a pat piece. So when I'm doing EPP, I'm holding the needle with my fingers to get precision, and I use that if I need to just add that extra push. So I push with this after placing the needle with this. When I'm quilting, I can use either finger because it's a running stitch and I'm placing the running stitch and pushing it along. It's a pushing motion. So when I am quilting, the fabric layers that I'm going through, and I will try, because I don't know for anybody who is unfamiliar with it. Whoops. Grab one of my thimbles. Let me see. I have a needle and thread. Okay. Let's see if I can do this. I have a needle. There we go. So I'm not going to actually show I'm getting rid of that, and that finger's just not going to work for me. When I am quilting, you put the needle straight up and down, and using your finger underneath, you rock. And that rocking motion creates the running stitch. Okay? And so I can use either one of those fingers because the needle is being held in the up and down by the fabric. Okay? So I don't have to have a lot of precision other than the original placement of the needle. And so I can, I have learned how to quilt with either finger. Now, what I'm going to say is that when I was younger, and much more susceptible to being told, oh, there's a right way and a wrong way, nobody told me that when I was quilting, which finger I was supposed to use. So I used them both. I became proficient in using them both. When I took up a EPP, I played around a little bit and I discovered I really did need to hold on to my needle with my index finger and my thumb, and then I use this to push through, especially if there's a lot of, when you're sewing a bunch of seams together at the end. So I learned how to do it that way. I'm going to tell you there's a lot of different thimbles out there. There is a lot of different techniques. You have to find what really feels right and works for you. There is no right or wrong. As I said, with most of my videos, and this works, this really goes for a lot of the stuff I do. The only right or wrong is if you have created something that is not structurally stable for the use you are making it for. Because then you're making something that is going to not hold up, and then all your effort feels like it might be wasted. And I don't think we should be sitting around doing things that make us feel badly because our time didn't have the effect we wanted it. Practice you can practice and still have beautiful things. Dedicating a practice sandwich quilt to just practicing your stitches is wonderful. But dive in. Don't be afraid, like my son has not been afraid. He's learned this from me. Don't be afraid to show your stitches. I had him start, because it's been a long time since he had a needle and thread in his hand, I had him start using the orange thread so that the stitches would disappear. But then when it came to doing this, he had no problem having those stitches show. Don't be afraid to have your imperfection in your practice show. Don't be afraid to have your practice pieces something that you share. I have a wonderful quilt that I've talked about a few times. It's now hanging in our little backyard bungalow that we've built for our son while he's here with us. I have the quilt that I made for his great-grandfather. No, for his grandfather. Great-grandfather, yes. His great-grandfather. I made a quilt for his great-grandfather years ago, and I had just got my first rotary cutter, but I didn't have the right rulers, and I didn't have the correct measurement, tools, so that I could make the calculations. And so all my stars have their points chopped off, but it's a lovely quilt, and it hangs on the wall in our little backyard bungalow, because we don't have to do perfect. We have to do structurally sound. It is structurally sound, so it has held up to the use. It's now being used as a wall hanging where it was used as a lap quilt years ago. Structurally sound, I will just say, quick note, I have different threads that I use. These are my quilting threads. These are my, what I use for English paper piecing. This is a thicker thread. This is a thinner thread. If I were doing the big stitch, I'd be using embroidery flosses, even thicker, to have the big stitch structurally sound so nothing's going to snag it and break it. These are, in most cases, cotton wrapped around polyester, or they've been spun specifically for hand quilting, but I can use regular universal sewing thread, which is, I think it's 30 weight, give or take, thread. I can use, this is a 50 weight. 40 weight is a standard embroidery, machine embroidery thread. I can use that. This is a finer 50 weight, bigger number, smaller the thread. I can use this for the EPP because I want tiny little stitches that disappear. You could use this for your quilting if you want your stitches to completely disappear. But one of the things to think about, and this is a I'm using all cotton threads. That. Whereas if I come to this one, it's not going to happen. So when you're doing threads that are the running stitch, it's good to have that tensile strength. It's not going to break. With embroidery, hand embroidery flosses and pearl cottons, if you're doing a big stitch with those multiple threads, they're going to hold that create the pearl cotton or create the embroidery floss, the stranded embroidery floss. Those are going to hold up because they have many multiple threads, and even if the individual thread may not be as strong as what you just saw with my hand quilting, the multiples of them together make them strong. So what I suggest, if you take this on, you don't have to go out and buy anything fancy. For either foundation paper piecing, you can go on and print out designs like this in a heartbeat. You can go on and find tons of free patterns in both of these ideas. English paper piecing, foundation paper piecing, and template rotary cutting. All of them, they're out there. Tons of free patterns. I've put up a bunch of my English paper piecing. I've put up a few of my rotary cutting patterns. I have a cat getting in my sewing box right now. You don't have to put a bunch of expense. You can, I suggest the fabrics that you use need to be an even weave. Usually cotton is preferred, but as long as it is not a high concentration of polyester, because cotton is really easy to get the threads, your stitching threads to go through. Years ago, I was working with some polyester double weave of my grandmother's, and I discovered that when you are trying to quilt through that, little by little, it shreds your quilting thread. So you have to use very small sections of quilting thread and keep rethreading your needle. So cotton is preferable, but you have a thrift store cotton shirt that's 50-50 cotton, woven, not knit. Go to town, cut it up, turn it into templates. You may not get as crisp of a press on the seams. You'll notice really crisp, open. It really lays flat. That's what the cotton will do. Linen would work as well. A tighter weave works better than an open weave, but not your high thread count sheets. Can be a little harder to hand needle. With a machine these days, you can machine quilt, you can machine piece, and you can go through pretty much any fabric. When we're doing it by hand, your high concentration of cotton woven fabrics are still going to be your gold standard. Now, one more thing just to say, and I'll try to show a picture of this. I'll get a picture to impose. There are my two needles. Oh, there's a little batting on it. Okay, let's see. There are my two needles. The short one is a quilting between. The long one is a I just went blank. Milliners. I'm using a milliner's needle as opposed to an applique needle. I've tried both of them. I like the milliner's needle. They're nice and thin. I do have to use a needle threader to get the thread through the milliners. I can still sometimes thread the quilting between without. When I have I have some glasses designed just for my crafting for my quilting. They have a better bifocal than my standard, these transition, but I need a good reading glass, good bifocal up front, when I'm trying to thread the needles. But those are the differences. Now, can you use a bigger needle to do the running stitch? Yes, especially if you're doing a big stitch. You're going to need a bigger eye for the needle, for the thread to go through. But when you're trying to do tiny little stitches like what I have done, and mine aren't as tiny as some, when you're trying to do the small traditional quilting stitches, the tiny little quilting betweens are our friend because they have a flexibility and a durability that can handle that pressure of the running stitch. Play around with your needles. Again, what works for you is going to be what's best for you especially when you're starting out. Start with a big stitch and try for even stitches if that is what you want to do. My son is transitioning between the big stitch to the finer. He's now using the smaller quilting needle and he's working on consistency, and it's okay. You don't have to go any smaller than that. That is okay. If that's still too small for you, get a bigger needle and do a big stitch. Get a bigger thread. It's easier sometimes to thread. It's easy. It can sometimes be really pretty, and there's lovely different threads out there. So I've talked about using pearl cotton. I've talked about using stranded embroidery floss. But if you have the ability either online or through a local quilting store, you can look specifically for 100% cotton, or you could use a polyester thread. In this case, this is fine. But what you want to be looking for is a 30 weight thread, a little bit thicker thread. Okay. You can even go, there's bigger than the 30. You can do, I think I have some that's a 15 and a 20. So we're not yet in the pearl cotton world, but they started making some of these for different projects years ago. So if you can find something that is a thicker machine thread, go ahead and try that. If you want to go thinner and you want to still do the big stitch, I would really recommend trying to not do too big of a stitch, or go with a polyester that's not going to want to break as easily. Because a thin, and I've said this before, a thin thread that's bigger, if your little pinky fingernail can catch underneath a thin thread, a running stitch with a thin thread like this, if something gets caught underneath it, remember I said the only difference between a running stitch and a gathering stitch is a gathering stitch has bigger spaces, bigger stitches. If you can get something caught under those threads, it can pull. And even if the thread doesn't break, your whole quilt is going to get gathered up, and you're going to really have to work to spread the gathers back out. So if you're trying to do this, if you want to go big, get some big chunky yarns. And for my hand spinners out there, and yes, I am going long today, for my hand spinners out there, if you've been working on spinning your silk is a fabulous big stitch quilting thread. All right, well, let's wrap this up before a full hour is gone. This one's definitely been a podcast. I will make sure to label it at the beginning that this is a podcast, which I knew it was going to be a podcast, but I thought for sure this would be just a 25-minute one. I think getting interrupted earlier might have thrown me completely off, but I love quilting. I love everything about quilting, and most importantly, I love sharing with people that it is something you can do. Whether you've been doing it for a long time or you're just brand new and all this is, brand new terminology and gibber. It is something that is doable. Patchwork is doable. Hand quilting or tying a quilt is a way to finish it. It is doable, and it is daunting to make a quilt for your bed. It is not as daunting when you are making, okay, so this one, a pillow. This is a patchwork pillow. It's patchwork in the fact that this block has been pieced together. It's done specifically to be wonky. It has machine embroidery here in the open area, and it has, if I zoom in, it has quilting, and it is, double check always, it is hand quilting. See my little stitches? So it is machine pieced. These blocks have been sewn to, these pieces have been sewn together with a sewing machine. It has had machine embroidery to make this beautiful handwriting, and my little elements here, the cat and the hat. And it's been hand quilted to create the sandwich that holds those three layers together and gives definition around the lettering. Machine pieced, machine embroidered, hand quilted. You can mix and match. You can, try different techniques. You can have fun. And you don't have to worry about whether or not it meets a standard. What you have to worry about is, does it meet the one important standard? Is it structurally stable for what you intend to use it for? That's what is important. Is it structurally stable for what you intend to use it for? A throw pillow like this that comes out once a year and doesn't get used in any other way other than to decorate the house doesn't need the same structural stability or quilting of the layers that something that's going to be used all the time on your bed would need. You can play with your practice. You can practice with pretty things. You don't have to just practice and say, well, it's just a practice piece. When I'm doing my machine quilting that I'm learning how to do on my long arm, I have a lot of practice pieces that I'm doing, but I am making structurally sound practice pieces that I'm donating. I'm making small baby quilts that will be donated. Practice can be pretty as long as it's structurally sound and as long as it's giving you joy. Go for it. I hope you've enjoyed this unwinding with fiber and fabric today. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Feel free to make a comment. Let me know if you like the longer podcasts versus the shorter podcasts. I wish I could have given you more of a B-roll tutorial. I wish I could have shown you a little more of the quilting today. I do have that in some of my older videos specifically on quilting. If you're interested in seeing it, go back and look. I have a playlist for quilting specific tips and tricks. I believe pithy projects. So you can go back and look through. But I'm hoping that you are enjoying the season. We finally have cool temperatures coming in, especially at night, and it is a joy. It's been a wonderful, wonderful time. I hope to see you again before 3 weeks are up this time. We will see what I'm creating. I'll give you more up-to-date information at that time on all the things that I'm doing in the background. But until then, happy unwinding with fiber and fabric.